So what are some examples of, for me, what comes up as the biggest challenge is architecture. At the end of the day, developers will write code. You'll get them to follow a discipline of, you know, following the right specs of, for the container and Kubernetes and the right policies and all the different archetypes you need to kind of get infrastructure to be fault tolerant and scalable. At some point, you'll get to that. But in terms of architecting and controlling this, and the word governance is almost like a taboo term. There's a lot of injury from the word governance, especially when you talk about that in context of developers and getting developers excited. How do you manage that balance of kind of bottom up excitement, driving empowerment, but when you have a gajillion 2 pizza box teams building loosely coupled microservices on a common infrastructure set of standards, how do you not try to how do you avoid this problem of governance that is so taboo? How do you do that?
I have a love-hate relationship with governance. I've seen it done well. I've seen it done badly. I think that ultimately what you're trying to do, governance, I used to talk about governance being a substitute for common sense. I would revise that statement somewhat now, and I think that it's about enabling accountability, right? So you can't just assume someone's going to have common sense because it's all contextual, right? What does a good decision look like for your particular organization? But are you enabling someone to be accountable, or are you just providing a big stick to beat them with? That's ultimately the difference between good and bad governance, right? Because ultimately, you want to shift this left as close as possible to the developer, the end user of those systems. If governance is centralized and kind of towards the end of the value stream, it's always going to be an obstacle. It's always going to be a blocker. It's always going to be a reactive thing. If you enable somebody to take accountability for that, and then you hold them accountable when they make a poor decision relating to governance, not in a way that punishes them or anything. It's not a detrimental thing, but it's an education piece. So we spent a lot of time thinking about what tests would we bolt onto developer pipelines. So at the point of them contributing code, they were getting direct feedback about things they could and should do to improve the quality of their code as it pertains to the architecture and the cloud environment that we're using. I think that also governance goes hand in hand with internal communities of practice. So how do you build a community around some of these governance principles? How do you make them real? Ultimately, all developers, all technical people love contribution. They love sharing. They love using someone else's stuff rather than having to write it themselves. How open source was built, right? Why build something if it's already worked somewhere else? And ultimately, if you can build that community, people feel like they can add their contributions to something, but it always adds value to the whole. So you can build, microservice frameworks, you can build cloud infrastructure templates, and you can basically bootstrap those across a community, which is then got cloud governance at its heart. So people are working and engaging in the way that they feel is useful and valuable to them, but the business is getting the thing they want at the end of it.
So what are some of the non-negotiables that absolutely have to be governed, or statically be they're in the Bible, that's it? And then what are the variables? So, and specifically answer this in terms of okay, we have a cloud native stack from infrastructure bare metal on up to your microservices. What are the variables and what are the static things?
So I think the absolute non-negotiables are expectations around security and cost management, right? There are probably legal requirements to have certain minimum thresholds of security. There are going to be compliance and regulatory requirements around how you're documenting spend. So typically, the kind of prerequisites are things like really solid IAM practices, really solid root account practices, great tagging and consistent tagging. And that's always been a challenge, right? Because there's always a finite number of tags you can apply to infrastructure. And you need to
And
leave
by
enough for
tags,
those
do you
tags.
mean, so talk about tags for a second. What do you mean by tags?
So just those kind of key value stores that you attribute to different pieces of infrastructure, right? You know, if you want to run a security policy, you need to have some consistent tagging and naming conventions so that you can run scans, you can discover issues, you can identify owners. You can't just let the cloud sprawl. You have to understand, and you have to be able to, from a central point, know who to ring, who to go contact about a particular part of your environment that is either wasting money or potentially creating a vulnerability. And if this stuff isn't tagged, you've got very little recourse to go find the team or the individual that's responsible for that infrastructure. So, you know, all the classic challenges of IT service management don't disappear in the cloud. They just have to scale in a different way. I think ultimately those are the two absolute non-negotiables. Everything else is business specific. So, for example, in the kinds of businesses I've worked in, we wanted to make sure there was some sort of central standards around logging and event management, so that, you know, there's future interoperability between standards and everything else that was going on from an events perspective. But in your particular organization, that may or may not be as important.